This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station.
BFM 89.9, good afternoon. I'm Roshan Kannison and welcome to Enterprise Explores, the show where we help you navigate the ever-changing universe of business from the headlines to the bottom line. Last week, US President Donald Trump reignited trade tensions with his so-called reciprocal tariffs, which kicked in today. And based on a formula that would see the US slap massive import duties on many countries across the globe, including some uninhabited countries, which includes a 47% rate on goods from Malaysia. But economists and analysts have raised red flags not just over the numbers, but the wider implication for global trade, including how these tariffs were calculated, which we'll get into through the course of this conversation, and what this all means for Malaysian businesses and the global economy. Joining me to break this all down is Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Center for Market Education. We'll unpack some of the flaws in the US tariff logic, the risks of a trade war, which is basically looks like it's been kicked off, and why he believes we should be using this moment, or Malaysia should be using this moment, to double down on services liberalisation and better bilateral relationships in the region and beyond. If you have any thoughts, you can WhatsApp us on our mobile number. That's 018-789-8899. Carmelo, how are you doing? Thanks for joining me on the line here.
Thanks. All well. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you in this conversation. Carmelo, I'm just going to go through some key updates that have come into play overnight. Now we seem to have over 100% tariff coming into play for China. A bunch of other things as well, 90% on goods shipped to the US from Temu and Shein. There is a lot going on in the world. It seems hard to keep up with a lot of it. You have people, markets obviously sold off yesterday, and you've got Elon Musk and Trump trade advisor Peter Navarro fighting in the press as well. It all feels like a comedy, but it's not a comedy. It's real life today. Before we get into the tariffs and all of that, Kamal, what are you paying attention to in detail right now?
Well, as you mentioned, Roshan, indeed is a quite a complicated scenario and a very much evolving scenario. And I look at the evolution of what is happening with great interest, because as you know, we also have criticized the way in which these tariffs have been calculated. But what is happening after the announcement is quite paradoxical, if you want, where we have more and more countries running after zero duties with the US or looking for new agreements. So Vietnam started first. Malaysia wants to negotiate. Indonesia wants to negotiate. And even internally, if you see what President Prabowo did yesterday, they are introducing a lot of new liberalization, even cutting down the local content requirements. So the effect of the announcement is, yes, to create an area of war, which I believe will end up to be mainly with China, but forcing others to really double their effort in terms of liberalization. So for me, we have to imagine the scenario like a card game in which the players are used to play according to certain rules. At a certain point, Trump enter the room, break down the table, and then say, okay, now we change the rule. Or at least he forced the people to sit down at the table with him. And part of the results of this are not bad if we see what is happening in terms of cutting duties and look for fresh trade agreements. So I don't know if this was intended or unintended in Trump's mind, but it's very interesting.
I mean, from a bull in a China house kind of perspective, it seems from countries like Indonesia, for example, where protectionism policies have been generally been quite strong over the last few years, where they're looking to make some local content liberalization moves there. And Carmelo will talk a little bit more about the trade war and all of that. But I want to take a step back a little bit, right? Because here at BFM, and of course every media outlet's been reporting on tariffs and updates and all of that. I want to get a little bit of a context setter here, right? Tariffs are nothing new, and with them being implemented, the US or Trump is pushing back tariffs to levels not seen since over 100 years ago, right? 1909 essentially, and there've been some beautiful graphs showing this basically very flat line, and then it just jumps up. Could you give us a sense for why the world had largely moved away from tariffs as a tool, and some of the lessons that we should be mindful from that historical perspective?
Yeah, actually, if you look at this really from an historical perspective, from a long run, and in particular taking a look at the history of international trades for the past 600 years, I would say that you really see cyclical movements there. So we have eras of protectionism and we have eras of free trade, and they alternate each other. And usually the change comes into play because of a mix of, let's say, theoretical belief, political interest or assumed political interest, and economic interest. The great era of protectionism, called mercantilism, was indeed based on the belief that the wealth of a nation is given by the amount of money that this nation has. And therefore, you had to make every possible effort to export a lot and import as less as possible. But when England, in example, turned toward liberalisation in the mid of the 1800s, this was mainly because of the interest of the new industrial class that had interest to export their new manufacturing products. More recently, I believe, in the era of free trade that emerged after World War II was indeed pushed by the great disaster that the first part of the 20th century has brought to the Western world with World War I and World War II, and therefore using free trade as a weapon for peaceful evolution of the international relations. So I think the history teaches us two things. One is that protectionism and free trade alternate, so there are cyclical movements there. And the second is that the reason behind changes is not always the same. So there are different forces at play.
It's like a pendulum swinging, right? It goes one way, then the other, and you always have a little bit of an overcorrection. It's just that now there's a lot of the game has a little bit been changed, and the rhetoric is very different. Economists are already downgrading outlooks, right, based on tariffs, and some of the other things we've seen in reaction is China placing more export restriction on rare earth elements, for example, very critical parts of supply chains. What are the key economic mechanisms through which tariffs hurt growth, jobs, and trade flows, essentially? Trade flows are quite clear, but how does it hurt the economy, right? Because right now that seems to be a key concern for most people.
Obviously, you see, when you reduce the possibility for trades, you are reducing the possibility for economic exchange, and basically you are reducing the market extent. That is, according to Adam Smith, is one of the key drivers of economic development. So by reducing the size of the market, you are forcing businesses to cut down what they were doing before. And cutting down means cutting down production, means cutting down jobs, and etc. So that is the real effect. So I think something that probably has not been emphasized enough is that rampant protectionism basically reduced the size of the market. And imagine if you are a firm and you see your market being reduced, obviously you have to take the steps to cope with a smaller market.
Ultimately, if you have barriers to trade and you've prioritized that as a part of your generating a revenue, this cuts off revenue for you as a nation or for your businesses, which in turn then makes you have to cost optimize internally, hence cutting jobs, that sort of thing, right? That's the ripple effect that we're looking at, or at least we're worried about.
Yes, correct. That's precisely the angle that we should look at. Is really like I'd like to use this metaphor: the market really shrinking down. So you were used to have a market of a certain size, and at a certain point, that market is shrinking down. This is the real damage from protectionism, reducing the size of the market, and therefore dealing with less occasions for exchange.
Yeah, which is greatly amplified when it's the biggest consumption market on earth implementing some of those changes, right? And how we've optimized for certain things in that sense. Carmelo, we got to go into a few messages. When we come back, I want to get into the math behind the tariffs and how they're very deeply or seemingly very deeply flawed, as well as the potential economic fallout for global trade and Malaysia as well. Folks, this is Enterprise Explores, the show where we help you navigate the ever-changing universe of business from the headlines to the bottom line. And today I've been speaking with Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Center for Market Education, about Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs and the potential impact from all of this. I'm Roshan Kanasan. We'll be back in just a bit, so keep it here to BFM 89.9, the business station.
Breaking financial matters. BFM 89.9.
BFM 89.9, welcome back to Enterprise Explores, the show where we help you navigate the ever-changing universe of business from the headlines to the bottom line. I'm Roshan Kanasan, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO of the Center for Market Education. And on this very gloomy afternoon, we are aptly unpacking the return of tariff-based trade policy in the US and how flawed the numbers are here in the tariff calculations and its potential downstream effects. Carmelo, whether intentional or not, depending on the game that the current administration is playing over in the US, Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs are based on numbers that many, including I think yourself, have criticized as misleading to say the least, and some might even say deeply flawed, and that's still being kind. Can you walk us through how these numbers were calculated and why these figures are flawed?
Yeah, actually, you see, when I saw the big table that Trump showed on TV at night, and I saw what were supposed to be the trade barriers that countries apply against the US, immediately my reaction was, well, if these numbers are real, maybe the American administration is not that wrong in trying to retaliate because they're so high. But these numbers were so high that immediately a doubt was raised in my mind. I said, how is it possible? We keep on saying that we are living in an era of free trade, so these numbers do not really make much sense. So then I look at how they were calculated, and indeed, basically they took for each country the trade deficit that the US have with this country divided by the import of the
and they tried to make it fancy, right? They added some additional factors to the denominator, which cancel each other out. So when you simplify it, it's basically exactly what you just said, which is calculating trade imbalance, essentially.
It's even not trade imbalance, because the trade imbalance would be the trade deficit.
Yeah.
And then you divide by the import that you have from that country. So in itself, even if we don't want to call that as a trade barrier, we want to give a name to that formula, that name doesn't exist. It's nothing that can be meaningfully defined. So I don't know if this was part of a bigger game, that says, okay, we just throw there absurd numbers in order to create that effect that we are seeing now. So to force basically everybody to sit back at the table with the United States. So this was like part of a very well-studied business strategy. So we look at more from a business perspective than from a political perspective, or if it was really nonsense without anybody realizing that.
I mean, it depends on where you want to look, right? If you want to be optimistic about, where they're coming from, then it's very tried and true Trumpian storytelling, right? Who cares what the facts are? I'm detecting new facts, and then we'll use this to tell our story, our narrative, and execute on our strategies that we want. And that's been repeated through the Trump era. It's just about whether it's intentional or not, which is where a lot of us are a little bit concerned. Because if you went to all this trouble to build a new formula to kind of justify it, why didn't you just come on and say, this is how much people are, this is the concern, this is why we're doing it. But I guess it goes to the stakeholder, right? Which stakeholder, I guess, from a narrative perspective, is he trying to tell the story? He doesn't care about the smart people, the economists, the professionals. He's talking to the base and saying, look at how unfair these other countries are to us. This is what we're going to do. And because we're kind people, we're going to give them a 50% discount. No one's listening after the fact otherwise. Our conversation here is going on deaf ears to his base.
No, it's precisely as you say, but it is a strategy that somehow is producing some result. Yeah? So that what is interesting from a political analysis perspective, and also what is happening that you mentioned earlier with Elon Musk and Navarro. I mean, this is somehow making emerging the conflict between two different spirits within the conservative environment.
Yeah.
So the conservative protectionist and those conservative which are instead being bred more in the free market environment. Like, I mean, Musk have been quoting Ludwig von Mises in certain occasions. So at least on paper, he have made certain readings part of his cultural background, let's say. So, but this conflict is actually positive, I believe, because it forces the Republicans, the conservative environment in America, to show their cards and to say which type of conservatives we are. We do believe in markets, and then markets are beneficial for people, or we don't, and we play the rhetoric of try to reindustrialize America. I believe that there is indeed like a business strategy here, because I think realistically speaking, even if you put all the tariffs in place that make sense to move back factories to the United States to restart manufacturing activities in the United States, and I think it's not going to happen. But even if you put that condition, it takes time for that reindustrialization to happen. It takes years. So it's not that you decide to set up a microchip factory and tomorrow morning
it's not going to happen during his tenure. Let's put it that way. It'll take multiple years to get all this done.
And I don't think that is so naive to not to know this.
Yeah.
So I believe that the administration is playing this game for whatever business strategy is there for a different purpose. The fact is that there is this tendency, this war tendency of being bipolar with the United States from one side and China on the other side. So the next era of trade will be revolving around the United States or around China. And with China being very aggressive with this strategy, with BRICS and so on, this looks like an extreme move to try to rebalance that table of discussion and forcing partners that would be naturally attracted, at least for geographical reasons, toward China, like Southeast Asia, to go back and discuss different conditions with the United States. So I think that this is the real game at stake, and what we are playing is like, let's call it a business strategy. It's like when a supplier kick out when a customer kick out the supplier because the price looks so exaggerate, and then at the end they sit down and negotiate the price. So that's how I tend to see it.
Carmelo, just to go back to the way the so-called tariffs were calculated, that so-called reciprocal tariffs, because it doesn't seem like there's anything really reciprocal about them. Why is calculating trade barriers based on the ratio of a trade deficit to imports problematic from an economic standpoint, or why is it more complex than just calling it a trade barrier?
Because, you see, trade barriers should measure the difficulties, let's say, that my product have to enter in a certain market. So like a shield, and these are usually tariff, and it's very clear, you apply a certain percentage toward the products that are entering a certain market, so that is naturally a barrier, or local content requirements, and we know the Apple cases in Indonesia recently. So these are clearly barriers, but what Trump did with the numbers is to associate barriers with trade deficits. So like if the barriers create trade deficit, and this is where the flow is. Actually, paradoxically, a country could be always in trade deficit and be a country which is healthy from an economic perspective, because that trade deficit is signaling that the country is financially and economically strong enough to buy everything from abroad. So trade deficit needs to be interpreted case by case. It's not necessarily negative per se. So to say that I have this trade deficit because there are trade barriers, then is where the ridiculous equation stands.
Because it also comes to, I guess, the aggregate wealth of a nation as well, right? Because some nations are able to buy more for a multitude of reasons. Some are more specialized in producing at a lower cost of goods, which is where trade has really taken us in that sense. And that aside, it's also, for those who have trade surpluses, they've been hit with the standard 10% tariff across the board, even uninhabited lands, right? So if you have a trade surplus, we're going to punish you as well to bring you to the negotiation table because we want to draw up lines around what this new multipolar world might look like. That, as to tie into what you said earlier, might be the game plan here.
Yeah, I believe indeed that, at least someone in the administration should be aware that all these numbers do not have an economic meaning. And there are other indicators of trade barriers. I have mentioned in other occasions the trade barrier index from the Tolos Foundation, other measures from research institutes. So there are serious ways to calculate these things. And therefore, I truly believe that here is a different game that we're trying to play. It's not really the game of announcing tariffs and putting their numbers, but putting their numbers to go in a different direction. So at least I want to believe that is the game, is a strategy, like a business strategy, that may be winning or not, but at least is a strategy.
So the US claims that Malaysia imposes a 47% barrier or tariff or reciprocal tariff tariff on its goods, though the accuracy of the figure is contested, with government saying that's actually somewhere around between 4 and 6%. I can't remember the exact number right now, effectively. Regardless of the actual number, what does this mean for Malaysia and the industries impacted, right? Exempting those that have exemptions right now, like the semicons and gloves.
This means rethinking the trade strategy in general. The United States are the most important export market for Malaysia. So obviously, a direct trade war between Malaysia and the United States is not playing well for the country. And the United States are more important than China as an export destination for Malaysia. So in this moment, I think at the macro level, so at the level of institutions, I think it is important to move ahead for negotiation for diversifying trade agreements with very simple free trade agreement. I mentioned in other occasions, a true free trade agreement is made of two lines. I can sell to you at zero tariff, you can sell to me at zero tariff. That's it. This is a free trade agreement. And any other things is just politics. That's it. So the second point is for firms to try to go together. Because this is one of the problems of Malaysian capitalism, being extremely fragmented. And if enterprises want to be stronger to compete in international markets, they need to aggregate themselves. They need to create network to be able to go in a more challenging scenario.
That's a very fascinating point, right? And something that has become more apparent to me in the last year. The fact that we have so many SMEs may not be a good thing. And maybe we should be having more mid-tier companies, larger companies, consolidation, so that they can bear the cost of regulation and tariffs and all these different things and compete internationally. That's one key thing that has been a theme over the last year or so, and it's interesting to see that we are developing, we've got a new acronym for it, MTC, mid-tier companies. But could you elaborate a little further on this consolidation and why it's important, Carmelo? Why do we need more of these companies to come together, whether through a formal M&A or through a consortium or something along those lines?
This is something I've been trying to preach for the past few years, because obviously, even if we think about a remanufacturing strategy that implies technological development, which implies research and development, obviously all these things require economies of scale, and you can't succeed in a scenario in which 98% of your companies are micro or small businesses, and 2% of the big companies made up of 40% of the GDP, or 60%, almost 60% of the GDP. So technological development is one thing, but there are other factors that requires economies of scale, social protection, social mobility. How can you grow your personal position as an employee in a micro business? Is obviously impossible. Now, with the new scenario and the requirement to go more aggressively abroad to be able to sustain the costs of unfavorable regulation, all this conversation becomes even more meaningful.
Carmelo, there's a concern that these tariffs could mark the start of a global trade war, and we are seeing, particularly between China and the US, this acceleration. Let's put it that way. What was supposed to be, I think, 45% tariffs, and now 104. China has other restrictions it wants to impose. How material of a risk is this in your mind, and what kind of future retaliation or levels of retaliation could we see from the bigger nations, not necessarily the smaller ones who may not have a lot of dry powder to kind of retaliate here?
In fact, I think the problem was since the beginning, the relationship between the US and China. So that is where the real battlefield is. And it is like if the US are forcing smaller countries to choose on which side they want to stand. And this is very, very dangerous approach, in particular for countries that never like to choose. They like to keep, one foot into shoes. But in general, I think that opportunities for trade will be reduced. So the wind has changed. So whatever outcome will be the final outcome out of this initial fight, I think will not be, the world will not be the same. And the international trade as we know it will not be there, at least for a certain amount of time, for a few decades. As part of a general wind change.
Yeah, this soft war, essentially, or this trade war, it's not a new thing. Trump's first administration came in, introduced some tariffs back then. Biden administration didn't reverse any of that, in fact, and the narrative continues. And in fact, if you want to really go into it, this all could have started even before the Trump administration, with Obama, with Bush, with a lot of these. Once China entered the open trade situation and started with their so-called, or at least claimed, unfair advantages to their local industry, which allowed them to make big waves in places like solar and manufacturing, of course. So this is a long-term game, and the main characters here, the US and China, the rest of us are side characters and don't really have the same level of muscle here. But if more countries follow down this protectionist path, Carmelo, could you give us a sense for what's at stake here, or a better sense for what's at stake here in terms of these global supply chains that we've optimized for, really, in the modern era?
We are going to suffer some earthquakes. Products will become more difficult to source. So ultimately, the biggest result would be less availability of goods and more expensive goods. But there will be also a reshaping on the manufacturing landscape. So I think the big difference between US and China in the relationship with Southeast Asia is that China is at least partially a competitor for Southeast Asian countries in terms of manufacturing. And so we may see some shift in the manufacturing structure, but these things, again, do not happen overnight. So it will take time for these changes to happen. And meanwhile, the process of adaptation will not be without some pain. This is what is going to happen.
You've advocated for Malaysia as well as the larger ASEAN bloc to double down on bilateral and multilateral trade deals. Give us a sense for what you think should be top priorities right now and ahead, and how we stay competitive amid rising protectionism, essentially.
Well, as I mentioned in other occasions, I think the most natural place where to look at the beginning is the European Union, which is still a very limited trading partner for Malaysia. I think we're talking about less than 8% of total trade for Malaysia if we count all the 27 European Union countries. So there is where there is still a lot of unexploited potential. But obviously this means also convincing the European Union to change their general approach to trade, because the European Union is quite a champion in non-tariff trade barriers in terms of rules, regulation, compliances. So we can't really say that the European Union toward what is non-European Union is a space used to easy negotiation for free trades. So also there is not something that is going to be easy.
And beyond government or G2G responses here, how should businesses be thinking about risk preparation or risk management in this potential global trade war?
Of course, prudence is very important. So prudence in building stocks, in planning production. So remain for a little while on the wait and see before planning investments. That is crucial. And as I mentioned earlier, I think imagining a strategy of consolidation, so of growth through mergers and acquisitions, it becomes crucial to be shielded from what is about to come.
Carmelo, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks to you. It was my pleasure indeed.
Folks, you've been listening to Enterprise Explores, the show where we help you navigate the ever-changing universe of business from the headlines to the bottom line. And today I was speaking with Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, CEO for the Center for Market Education, about the flawed math behind Trump's so-called reciprocal tariffs, but also the possible method to the madness there, the potential business strategy underlying it, or the narrative, as well as what businesses and policymakers should be deeply thinking about and considering ahead. If you missed any part of this conversation, go and catch the podcast or revisit the key highlights on our website at bfm.my or download the BFM app. Our shows are also available wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Just look for Enterprise Explores by BFM Media. I'm Roshan Kanison. Keep it here to BFM 89.9, the business station.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app. You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.